Have a little laughter because you may not 5, and be honest with you, I thought at first, well shoot, I'm just going to skip over this part, and then I felt a little convicted about that, so no, it's a part that needs to be shared, and so we're going to share, but I think it's best to share it today with some disclaimers. And the first one is to understand this is God's guidelines for marriage. It is not something that we're making up, something that we're sharing with you. This is what God has put in place for marriage. Now, reading this passage of Scripture today in 2019 in America, not other parts of the world, but in America, there would be those of you sitting here today that would say, well, that's just sexist. That's archaic. You might say it's bigotry. It's male chauvinism. You might even say it's fascism. And the reasons for that is America has moved to a point of equalitarianism culture, meaning man and woman is alike. And the roles of man and everything else about a man and a woman are the same. We cannot define any roles in society anymore based on whether you're a man or a woman. That's where America is at. And so, from an American standpoint, whether it's the workplace, out society, in church, wherever it may be, then it's equal. And of course, bad teaching. I mean, this is a passage of Scripture that has been taught poorly, and the results of that speak for themselves. And there's bad TV, because we learn a lot about life on TV. A lot of what we believe, even some of the principles in which we shape our marriage with, many of those come from TV, and that's bad TV. And I'm going to tell you the worst TV show ever in the history of the world when it came to marriage was Archie Bunker and All in the Family. Now, obviously, Archie Bunker was extremely racist, so to watch that in 2019, that would hit you like a ton of bricks, how racist it is. But you remember, he always referred to Edith as a dingbat. He had the full chair, if you remember, the full recliner cushion chair, and she had a little wooden chair, smaller, next to her. And she beckoned at every command that he made. And it was a terrible picture of what marriage is. But now, as I mentioned before, the pendulum always swings, but when it swings from one end to the other. And for the last 15 or 20 years, when you look at television and you look at marriage, when you see a man and a woman on TV who is married, the man is a dingbat. Right? He's an absolute idiot. He is inept, irresponsible, and the wife calls every shot. And so modern TV is just as bad when it comes to the issue of marriage as the Archie Bunker was, just different. Obviously, part of the problem is the absent man. We have men who have abdicated his God-given roles and said, no, wife, you do it. You be responsible. You take responsibility for the home. And the man has become absent in his God-given role. The spiritual condition, or the lack of a spiritual condition of man, creates a problem in the marriage. And let me just put the cards on the table. And women who want to be the head creates a problem in marriage. Now, there are women who will not let their husbands lead the home, and they are out of biblical correctness. So, taught right, and that's what we're hoping to do today, is teach this right, then you'll find this principle of marriage to be like every other principle in the Bible, that if you follow it, it will make your life better. You with me? It will make your marriage better. It will make your home better. You will live a more blessed, more fruitful, more peaceful, more happy life when we follow the principles of God's Word. Now let's go back to marriage before we actually get into the Scripture today and understand that, as the video pointed out, it's God who came up with this marriage thing. It's not something that a man thought of, not something that a woman thought of, Adam and Eve. And God brought them together. He joined them together. And marriage begins by its very act. God gives us a mathematical equation. That the only way you're going to have a good marriage, the only way it's going to be a good, healthy marriage, is you've got to learn a little math. And this is going to be the hardest math lesson you ever learn in your life. Two become one. Two become one. How do you take two unique personalities two unique opinions, two unique value systems, belief systems, people who have been raised differently. And how do you bring those two everythings into your life and come to one? Well, what a lot of marriage couples do is one tries to push the other one to give up all their rights, to surrender all their opinions, just to fold into them, and therefore they think they're one, when no, one is just whooped. The only way you can get 2 to 1 is God is saying you each have to give up half yourself. For the greater good, for the greater cause, for the greater purpose of marriage, each of you have to give up half of everything that you are to give to that other person. Man created man and he created woman distinctly different. How many of you believe that in 2019 men and women are different? And it's not just in our physical makeup and parts of the body, physiologically, emotionally, everything, we're different. And when we fail to recognize that difference, we're making a humongous mistake. And that's what society is doing, is creating this great era by trying to say, no, everything is equal. And it's not. I love Gary Smalley's book, Hidden Keys of a Lasting Marriage. Man, this book came out in the late 80s, early 90s. And he said there's 3 reasons marriage failed. Number 1, storybook expectations. Number 2, limited training. Because, see, when you come into a marriage, really the only thing you know about being married is what? What you saw in your parents. So good, bad, ugly, that's really what you bring into the picture. But the third one is this: lacking understanding of the differences and the needs between a man and a woman. When I teach a marriage seminar, one of the things I always use, when I do marriage counseling, one of the things I always use is based upon the book His Needs, Her Needs, and it's identified from surveying thousands and thousands of men and women that there's 5 basic needs a woman has, there's 5 basic needs that a man has. And listen, they're totally different. There's 5 things on the man's list are not the 5 things on the woman's list. They're totally different. For example, the very first thing on a woman's list is she wants to be loved. She wants to be shown affection. Number 1 thing on the man's list, he wants to be shown respect. Very different. And when we fail to understand the differences in who we are and the differences in needs that we have, then we're on the wrong path. And understand that in marriage, man and woman, God has established have different roles. It does not mean that one is superior to the other, but you do have a different function. So when you go back and you read Genesis chapter 4, God says to Adam, you're going to go out, you're going to toil the land, you're going to be the farmer, you're going to be the provider, you're going to go out there and do the work and bring the bacon home, so to speak. And the woman, you're going to give childbirth and you're going to be the homemaker. It was different roles. Not one was better than the other, but just different roles in marriage. We're going to look today at the principle in verse 21 of chapter 5 of Ephesians, the key to it all. Marriage, like anything else in your life, has to be based upon reverence to Christ. Remember last week, verse 1 of chapter 5 said to imitate Jesus. As a follower of Jesus, imitate Jesus, model Jesus. And so we're going to see the picture today as Christ so loved his church, his bride. That's the way a man is to love his wife. The only thing, as we get into this today, that I want to do better than what Paul did. Everything Paul says is wonderful, is right on the money, it's of God. The only thing that he could have improved was changing the order in which he spoke it. Because he speaks in verse 21 the words that this is the problem of the whole message today. Wives, submit to your husbands. That's the one phrase out of all of this today that's going to raise up anybody's hair and get anybody worked up. It's going to be that one line. And that's not where he should have started. And so we're going to teach it in the way I think it should have been taught, but let's read it the way that it's written. If you would, stand with me, please. Ephesians chapter 5. We'll start in verse 21. Submit to one another out of reverence to Christ. So a general principle for all of us is submit to one another. Wives, submit yourselves to your own husbands as you would unto the Lord. For the husband is the head of the wife, as Christ is the head of the church, his body, of which he is the Savior. Now, as the church submits to Christ, So also wives should submit to their husbands in all things. Husbands, love your wives, just as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her, to make her holy, cleansing her by the washing with water through the word, and to present her to himself as a radiant church, without stain or wrinkle or any other blemish, but holy and blameless. In this same way, husbands ought to love their wives as their own bodies. He who loves his wife loves himself. After all, no one ever hated their own body, but they feed and care for their body, just as Christ does the church. For we are all members of one body. For this reason, a man will leave his father and his mother and be united to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. This is a profound mystery, but I'm talking about Christ and the church. However, each one of you must also love his wife as he loves himself, and the wife must respect her husband. Thank you, BC. So let's start the way I think would have been the better role for Paul to have taken, and that is instructions to the husband. Because men, I'm going to tell you something. If you can be the kind of man, the kind of husband that Paul is talking about here, you will have no problem with your wife in any form, any way, submitting to you. So the first thing that he tells us here is that the husband is to be the head of the home. This is the God-given role. We're going to see that word head meaning the governor, meaning the leader, not a dictator. Now listen to me carefully. You're not a dictator in your home. You're not the king of the castle. The best terminology that we can use today to bring this into to Greek, into modern day English, is to think of it in the terms that you're a governor. You're the leader of the home. You know, Woodrow Wilson was famous for putting on his desk there in the Oval Office those words, "The buck stops here." He understood his role, that, you know, the decision was final with him. So this has that implication that, no, man, you're not superior to the woman. You're not given authority in that sense over the woman. You're not given any type of control over the woman. You're told to be the spiritual leader of your home. You're told to be the head of your household, the head of your family. We'll talk about that more in a moment. In verse 23 also, the second part, you're to model Christ. It says Jesus is the head of the church. And so the way you see Jesus lead his church is the way you're to lead your home. See, Christ exercised all of his leadership in order to bless the church, to protect the church, to provide for the church, to empower the church. And the man is to do the same. And nothing gets tougher in verse 25. My very first church, I'm pastoring. An old drunk named Henry. Different Henry. He gets saved. Genuinely saved. His wife and his kids had already been coming to church for quite a while. He gets saved, he stops drinking, and you know, he's starting to learn the Bible and stuff. And one night he called me up and he said, he is fired up. And they have been fussing and fighting because she would not submit to him. And he just read where she's told to submit to him. And I said, well, Henry, did you read the next verse? What's the next verse? Love your wife the way Christ so loved the church and gave himself for her. Next thing I know, he's wanting to come beat me up. And he didn't like that part. And probably most of us don't like that part. But listen to this, men. Love your wife as Christ so loved the church. And here's the catch. This is not, the Greek uses different words for love. When you're talking about a man and a woman, generally when you say, I love you as a man and woman, it comes from the Greek word eros. That's not eros here. This is agape. Agape is God's love. You're going to love your wife with God's love, not your love. Because your love is never going to be enough. Your love is always going to be flawed. Your love is always going to have the imperfection. And I'm telling you, with God's love, because you are being a follower of Jesus Christ, as we talked about last week. You're imitating Christ. You're submitting your life to Christ. You're being transformed by the workings and the power of Christ. And with the love of God that you're experiencing, this is the love I want you to now share with your wife. See, I want you to lay down your life, Paul says, just the way Jesus laid down his life for the church. First, it's just husband and wife. And then, at some point, usually, little children come along. And when you go back to that mathematical problem, two becoming one, every one of us are selfish people. And everybody has wants. And all of a sudden you find, even, for example, financially, there's not enough money to go around for everything. Your wife has needs. There's clothing that she has need of. Maybe there's medical things that needs attention. Then you have children, and of course children, they have to be fed, and daycare expenses, and then you have school expenses, and they have to have shoes and all of that. And this is part of what he's saying. And Ben, where do you come in this picture? Last. Last. You're going to make sure your wife has what she needs before what you need. You're going to make sure your children have what they need before you get what you want. Now listen, anybody here have a shotgun wedding? So that means you chose to get married, right? These are vows that you made. You're going to lay down your life for her. It's your responsibility in your home to make her holy. That spiritually, she's going to be cleansed by the work of the Word. She's going to be presented to Christ without spot, without wrinkle, without blemish. That she's going to be presented a glorious church. She's going to be presented as a glorious woman before God, just as the bride is going to be presented to Him, Jesus, as a glorious church, splendid and honorable. See, most couples look their best and they're most glorious the day they get married. But how many of you think they should look more glorious the next year, 10 years later, 20 years later, than they looked on the day of the marriage? That's what Paul is saying here. And it starts with the responsibility as the wife. Now, this is what I love about what Paul is writing. It goes back to what you see on the banners. Because Jesus, he follows Jesus' example here of teaching that we're slow to get. I mean, spiritual growth and all those things is a growth process, right? These are things we have to learn. These are things that we have to grow into and all of these things. So it's a growth process. So remember, Jesus said the greatest command is to love God with all your heart, all your soul, and all your mind, and then love others. But what did he add to that love other part? As you love yourself. So you may not have this love of God mastered, but I guarantee you, you mastered a long time ago the love of yourself. So now here Paul is saying, I want you to love your wife, agape, again. But if you haven't got all that figured out, do what? Love her as you love yourself. Love her the way you love yourself. You know how to take care of yourself. You know how to get the things that you need in your life. So love her, treat her, and to have a desire for her just like you have these things for your own self. Now let me throw in here 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 7. Where Peter writes on marriage to the husband, be considerate of your wives and treat her with respect. Now, I want to ask you for this, but most women in this room would say, that kind of husband I would follow. That kind of husband I would follow. And that's the kind of husbands that we need to be committed to be. So let's go back to the wife. And let's go back to this favorite verse of all women in the Bible. Submit to your husband as you do unto the Lord. That's a pretty close association thrown in there, isn't it? You submit to the Lord. You submit to your husband just like you submit to your Lord spiritually. So let's do a Greek lesson here because you're not going to get this in English because the word submit ain't going to cut it in English. Let's go back. It's from the Greek word hutuso, and it goes back to an old military phrase, and it's a soldier and commanders. That any army, in order to be successful, any army, in order to function, there has to be leaders. There's soldiers and there's leaders. You go into the military, you have that private first class, corporal, sergeant, and gunny sergeant, and you go up those steps, and then you have your lieutenants and your captains. And man, when you're down there at that private, everything's above you, right? It's taking us back to that type of picture. Because how many of you heard this phrase, which in 2019 will sound racist to say from the pulpit, but for no better words to use, but how many of you have heard that phrase, too many chiefs, not enough Indians? And you can never function that way, right? An army could never win if everyone was an officer. Never. It would be in total turmoil. So it builds upon that, but it takes a different meaning. That's its original meaning, but here's the definition of hutoso. It builds upon that, and it says this is a voluntary attitude of cooperation. That you're going to subject yourself or yield to your husband. Voluntarily. That you understand that everything must have a lead. It doesn't matter what it is. I want you to understand something this morning of truth that you need to understand. No organization, no institution, including the church in the world, no business, can survive under equal partnership. It's impossible. So two men get together and they decide to go into business together. They decide they're going to be 50-50 partners. They're going to make these decisions equally. How long do you think that would last? They're going to come to a point because they're two unique individuals, two unique different thought processes, two unique dream systems, and they're going to come to a place in the business of conflict. But it's a 50-50 partnership. So one's either going to have to completely yield and be defeated, or they're just going to dissolve and maybe even go bankrupt because of the conflict that is created. Nothing can exist with equal partnership. Now, within a church like ourselves, do you understand? Pretty much anything that we do is simple majority rule. But what happens if it was 50-50? So if we had a church conference today and it's 50-50, guess who gets to break the vote? Who gets to break the tie? I do. If we're in a board meeting and it's a 50-50 vote, and who gets to break that tie? I do. There has to be in any organization for it to function someone who has to have the leadership role. And it's true in the marriage as well. So we've been taught this stuff. You know, our marriage is 50-50. No, I think your marriage should be like 49.5, 50.5. 49, 51. Because somewhere the buck has to stop here. You're not going to agree on things as a husband and wife. You're not going to agree on which bills need to be paid, which needs to be paid first. You're not going to agree on which car we're going to get, which house we're going to buy. We're not going to agree on discipline when we have children. We're not going to agree on daycare. We're not going to agree on lots and lots of things. Kids get a little bit older and they want to go to the prom. We're not going to agree with that. What time they're supposed to be home, we're not going to agree with that. What time should the child's curfew be? We're not going to agree on that. How are we going to come to a decision? That the husband, as the head of the home, will have the final word when we cannot make that decision. Now, obviously, does it not work more wonderful in that partnership of marriage that we both can come to those decisions together? Sure. But there's going to be those times. But that just doesn't work. And that's exactly what it's saying. That I understand God has given the husband this role, and I'm going to voluntarily submit myself and yield to my husband on this matter. Your marriage cannot work. It will not work. Unless somebody's leading the home. And if it's not the husband, your marriage is not going to work, because I guarantee you, your husband will come to a point, he'll say enough's enough. He may put up with it for a while, but he won't put up with it when another option avails itself. Trust me. Submit to him in everything, but understand exactly what this means. Everything doesn't mean everything here. It means anything and everything which is biblical. Everything is lawful. In other words, if a man tells his wife to jump, is she supposed to jump? Only if she jumps up to hit him in the head. No. That would be a total misuse of that God-given role. If it's not in the Bible, and it's not according to the laws society, then you have no right in any other way to try to get your wife to do anything, because that's what we call abuse. It's what we call misuse and abuse and a lot of other things that it would be called. Let me remind you, men, of one thing. God's going to hold you accountable for your marriage. He's going to hold you accountable for your children. You're the head of the home. See, the Bible tells us each one of us is going to give account to God for all the different roles we have. When I stand before God, I'm going to give account to God as a husband, as a father, as an individual. I'm going to give God account as a pastor. So how did I do my job as a pastor? How did I treat the people? How did I exercise the authority over the local church that God has given? I'm going to give account for that. Does that make any of you nervous? That you're going to stand before God and give account for the way you treat your wife, or wives, for the way you treat your husbands, the way you're being a father or not being a father or a mother. Scary stuff. In verse 33b, respect your husband. Now I know what some of you are saying. My husband hasn't earned my respect. But somehow in the midst of it, you've got to learn to give respect. Even if he hasn't earned your respect, that you've got to give him that role. Again, the number one thing that a woman wants in marriage, according to the research, is to be loved, to have affection shown to her. Number one thing a man wants from his wife is to be shown respect. And every married couple that I do counseling with, I always give them these 5 things, and under it in large print of these words: and if you do not meet the needs of your spouse, someone else will. Do you hear me? And I guarantee you, Satan will make a point of introducing into your spouse's life someone who will show them respect. Someone in the woman's life that will show her love and show her affection. See, God's design for marriage is for you to live in partnership together and find joy and peace. Not even sure if happiness is to be attained, because happiness is not found in the Greek or the Hebrew language. That's one of the American things that's been thrown in there in translation. But to find that meaning and find that value. So let me close this morning. Nobody's walked out yet. That's a good thing. Nobody's thrown anything. That's good. But I thought about this. I should have taken the Bibles and hymnals and everything out of the pews. Anything that could be thrown and put them somewhere. But let me talk to you, ladies, for a few minutes. And I think these things carry over, but particularly to you ladies. I'm going to tell you, there's not a lot of biblical men in there. It's just my experience. Just look around the church. Look at any church, not just First Wesleyan Church. Look at any church USA. How many of you always say you'll find a lot more women there than you find men? How many of you would agree with the statement? If it wasn't for women, there would be no church today. And of course, a lot of you here are widows. But every Sunday you can look at married women who are here by themselves. So what do you do? What do you do when your husband doesn't seem to want to be a godly man? Or men, even what do you do if your wife doesn't want to be a godly woman? Let me share with you 2 passages today. First one, 1 Corinthians chapter 7, if you'll turn there. I should have done this in King James versions, but I don't have King James version with me. But I'm going to give you the principal King James style, but I'm going to give you what it says here in NIV. If any brother has a wife who is not a believer, this is down in verse 12. If any brother has a wife who's not a believer and she's willing to live with him, he must not divorce her. And if a woman has a husband who is not a believer and he's willing to live with her, she must not divorce him. For the unbelieving husband has been sanctified through his wife, and the unbelieving wife has been sanctified through her believing husband. Now in King James it says, if thou be pleased to dwell with thee. I like that. If thou be pleased to dwell with thee. It's telling you that here you are as a believer. Now think about this. See, everybody didn't have my story. See, Jill and I met in college. So I'm there, doing my ministerial training, and she's there, working on her degree. She's from a Christian home. I'm now a Christian. So there's things that we incorporated into our marriage from the beginning. We were both Christians. We already practiced tithing. So, we didn't have the money issue if we were going to pay tithe or not. My tithe check is in there today. And so those were not issues that we had. But what happens when that's not your story? You met somewhere along the line and one was a Christian, one was not a Christian. Or you met and both of you were not Christians and then one becomes a Christian. What happens when both of you are Christians but one doesn't want to go any further? They don't want to get any deeper. They think they're good enough. It's good enough the way it is. But you want to go deeper in your walk. You want to be more committed. You can see how complicated this can become. So Paul, again, has given us this principle that but if you got a spouse that loves you, and they're pleased to live with you, in other words, they don't want to be divorced. You're a Christian, they're not a Christian, but they don't want to be divorced over that. Then he says you don't have the right to put them away. You can't use not being a Christian as a reason to divorce them. This is what he goes on to say, but if you'll live your life out for Christ, if you'll continue to be faithful to the Lord, there's a pretty good chance he or she's going to become a Christian. Isn't that a wonderful principle? Look what Peter writes. In 1 Peter chapter 3, he kind of takes it pretty much the same thing, but it's a little bit different. And I want to give you a perfect example of this, and we'll close. In 1 Peter, we're getting the right one here. Wives, in the same way, submit yourselves to your own husbands, so that if any one of them do not believe the word, they may be won over without words by the behavior of their wives, when they see the purity and reverence of your life. Your beauty should not come from outward adornment, such as elaborate hairstyles and the wearing of jewelry or fine clothes. That's a beautiful Pilgrim Holiness verse right there, that most of you missed. Rather, your beauty should be that of your inner self, the unfading beauty of a gentle and quiet spirit, which is of great worth in God's sight. What Peter's saying is, whether your husband is a believer or not, you let him be the head of the home. And let me tell you this, not only let him be the head of the home, make him the head of the home, make him be responsible. Because you tell him he's not going to be a wimp. That you're not going to be the one held responsible. You see, this is what men love to do today. In 2019, men love to let their wives make the decisions and then gripe about every bit of it. They want to fuss. Every time something goes wrong, they want someone to blame. Right? Somebody, raise your hand if you think I'm being wrong. This is it, isn't it? But you look at your husband and say, you're going to be the head of this home. This is what God made you, and you're going to give account to God for it. And so you take responsibility for this home. You take responsibility for these children. Show them the respect, but hold them accountable. If he's going to be the leader, then he's got to be held accountable as the leader. But I love this. Because what Peter is saying, if your husband's not a believer, you live your life out. Let him see your purity, this inward beauty that exceeds physical appearance. And what does Peter say will happen? He'll be won to the Lord. Isn't that good stuff? He'll be won to the Lord. When we pastored in Jacksonville, we had a military couple in the church, and I won't use their name because she actually watches us on Facebook each week. And she was probably one of the most committed people we had in the church. She was one of those, she had grown up with Wesleyan out in Indiana. And when the doors were open, she was going to be there. You had a project going on, she was there. You needed something done, she was going to jump on there and do it. She loved the Lord. She loved the church. Her husband didn't want anything to do with church. He didn't want anything to do with God. Nice guy. Good father. He was a good husband. But didn't want anything to do with God. Didn't want anything to do with the church. But to his credit, he never interfered with her coming to church. He never, never was one of those men on Sunday morning that said, no, I want us to go down to the beach today. No, he understood she was going to church. And after church, if they wanted to go to the beach, they'd go down to the beach. About 4 or 5 years after we left Jacksonville, we see her. And guess what had happened to her husband? He had become a follower of Jesus Christ. And he's still following Jesus to this day. Now they go to church together. But see again, what would the average wife do? The average wife is going to be a nagger. Complainer, moaner, groaner. I'm not going to ask, but how many of you have ever told your husband how sorry they are? How worthless they are. And you might even look down and say, you're just going to go straight to hell. I love that passage, though. Man, live out your life. This is a good life principle. Live out your life in front of everybody as the real deal. And people are going to want that Jesus. Marriage is tough. How many of you figured that out? And it didn't take you long, did it? But how many of you have found marriage to be one of the most blessed things in your whole life? You wouldn't trade it for anything. So, 36 years into it myself. There's still some things Jill needs to work on. And I'm helping her. I make her a list every day. And then there's those of you here today who would give anything in the world to have your spouse back. And you look at these other couples and say, why are you being so stupid? Why are you wasting so many moments? Why are you fussing about things that don't matter? Cherish one another. Because the day is going to come, they're not going to be there to cherish one another. Let's pray. Father, it's a different passage today